first novels include Nobody's Fool and Empire Falls, his latest book, Interventions, which we'll discuss this evening, and his memoir entitled Elsewhere, which will be out in November. Kate Russo was trained at the Slade School of Fine Art in London, and she's exhibited her work all over England. And the Russos have teamed up for this beautiful book, and they are going to talk about the state of publishing, the written word, designing a book together. We welcome Kate and Richard Russo.
Thank you. I think we're going to try to do this without these.
I don't think, yeah, I just take them. It's fine.
Okay. All right.
And actually, with that fan going, we might need it anyway. Well, no, I think it's fine. This will work, yeah.
Is it? Oh, yeah. It is.
Yes.
Well, thank you for coming. This is just such an incredible venue, isn't it? It's wonderful, given what we're going to be talking about tonight. This book, but also the state of publishing that caused us to even think about doing a book like this. Some of the bloggers have written about this book as if it were a kind of anti-ebook, and that's not the way we thought about it. I don't have anything against ebooks, and neither does Kate. It's a very pro-book book, however, and I guess that's if it weren't for ebooks, as we've been talking about it, then over the past really several years around our dinner table, as electronic books have continued to eat into the publishing business, claiming a larger and larger share every year. So we've been talking about this project for a long time. And before I continue too, I want to give a small shout out here to Kate's husband, Tom Butler, who is here tonight as well. Tom is the designer of this book. We're just incredibly proud of the way it looks and feels in the hand. This design with the slipcase, the individually bound volumes. That's all Tom's design, and was part of the conversation over the last several years as we put this book together. I'm also going to begin, before we get into the discussion, just kind of apologize to you up front. I've got some kind of allergy thing going today. You can probably tell just by looking at my eyes. I woke up this morning with my left eye kind of fused shut at the molecular level, and it's much better now. But I'm going to be barking at you a little bit tonight, and I hope not, but I may be. And if the eye begins to close again, well, then I just don't want you to be too frightened about what's happening here. I'm not dying. All right, so this is such an intimate gathering tonight. I will do kind of a pared down version of my part of this, which is to set a kind of context for this book, and to talk about the publishing industry, the state of the publishing industry as we now find it, which is, I can only say, deeply, deeply, deeply bizarre. And part of it has to do with technology. There's that wonderful cartoon that was in the New Yorker a couple of weeks ago. I'm sure some of you noticed it. There was a couple of guys standing in front of what looks to be the first printing press, taking the first book off the first printing press. And one says to the other, "Yeah, it's okay, but as long as people are interested in the stories, they're going to want to read scrolls." And that's kind of the situation that we find ourselves right now in this enormous technological revolution, the digitization not just of books but of the record industry, photography, film. So we're caught in the middle of this, and it seems to us like there are just incredibly momentous things going on. But in fact, since we're in the middle of it, we don't have a real great view. We'll have a better view looking back a decade hence, but such important things are in play right now that a decade hence, when we finally figure out what it all means, it may be too late. And that's kind of the situation that we're in. right now. Excuse me, at least as I see it. When I broke into this business, my first novel, Mohawk, was published in 1986. And at that time, the publishing industry was oh, thank you very much. The publishing industry was in a very, very different state than it is right now. On my first book tour, and I'll stop right there just to say my first book tour, this is with my first novel, you wouldn't find very many writers today, young writers, going on book tour with a first novel. It just isn't done. And that's because the landscape, these things were expensive. The landscape has completely changed now. Book tours are done almost exclusively by the people who need them least. People like Richard Russo and Scott Turow, my friend from the Writers Guild, and Stephen King and Ann Patchett, and people who have basically household names. But at that time, I got sent to probably somewhere between half a dozen and a dozen cities. I remember my first stop was Chicago, and they put me at some place like the Drake or the Palmer House or something like that. And during the next day, I remember when I checked in, when I checked out, I got the bill, and I saw what it cost for them to put me up there, and I also knew what it cost for them to send me to Chicago to begin with. And then I had a per diem. They just whatever I had in the hotel was on the Random House tab. And as a result of all of this, and then I moved on to then I went on to San Francisco, where I saw the same thing happening. And during that entire tour, I kept doing what I shouldn't have been doing, which was doing the arithmetic in my head of what this was costing my publisher, and what they were going to think when they discovered that they had spent these many, many thousands and thousands of dollars sending me all over the place, and went to bookstores, many of them which don't exist anymore. My first bookstore was Barbara's Books in Chicago, as it's been gone for a very long time. And a lot of the other great independent bookstores that I went to on that first book tour are also gone now. My publisher also spent money on one of those little side ads, strip ads. I don't know whether it was just me or me and another writer in the New York Times Book Review, maybe something else in the New Yorker or the Wall Street Journal, maybe the San Francisco Chronicle. And as I was doing the arithmetic and then looking at audiences, and if this audience had been there at that time, I would have thought that was. I would have thought that was astonishing. They were putting out optimistically 5 or 7 chairs, and what I didn't realize at the time was that all the backsides of those chairs were in fact employees from the bookstore that I was visiting. But I chatted with people and I signed books, and just felt extraordinarily guilty the entire time that I was on the trip, and thinking that my publishers, when they got the bill and when they found out how few books were sold, we're just going to, that would be it. This would be my last book tour. They would never be foolish enough to send me on another one. But the point that I'm making about all of this is that publishers, in what used to be their traditional role, were like venture capitalists. What I didn't know then was that they didn't expect a return on their investment right then. They were working on what used to be known as the John Irving model, which was that a good writer, a writer that they recognized as having talent, would in the course of the career have modest sales, and then a little bit more, a little bit more, a little bit more, and if you're very lucky, at some point, you write The World According to Garp, and then suddenly you are a household name, and it's then. But I mean, these books don't get written overnight. So if it's your 5th book, I mean, do the arithmetic yourself. And if it takes 3 or 4 or 5 years, that means that Random House, which was publishing John Irving at the time, I believe, you're looking at not only a very large investment in terms of advertising and the author's advance and all the travel and all that, but you're not really expecting to get paid back for it for about 15 years, probably, before you finally reach the break-even point. I don't probably need to tell you that that's not the model anymore. And what worked for me, and what worked for John Irving, and what worked for a lot of writers of our generation, was the system that I've described to you that allowed for publishers to bide their time and allow great bookstores like the Strand, excuse me, to get the word out, to hand sell books. And that's what, as a result of my travels that year, that's exactly what happened. And as a result of that, they sold a few books, and then my next book, The Risk Pool, came out, and they sold a few more books, and there was a gradual accretion. And it was along about the time that the movie of Nobody's Fool came out, my third book, that suddenly I began to make sense to my publisher, economic sense to my publisher. The world has changed. Writers don't have that long. There are fewer newspapers in which to advertise writers' books. Fewer of those newspapers now review books. And the independent bookstores were under assault when I started out by something that doesn't even really exist anymore. The big bully on the block was Walden Books. Remember Walden Books? All those mall bookstores? They're gone. And then the new bullies came along with Barnes & Noble and Borders building these great big box stores right across the street from some of the great independent bookstores in America. They built one right across the street from the Tattered Cover in Denver. And that was their business model. Borders is now gone. And Amazon, and Barnes & Noble, there are actually people in the book-selling community now who are hoping that Barnes & Noble, last year's bully, is going to be able to hold on, because if they don't, Amazon, which already holds about 75% of the market for books that are sold online, that is both print and electronic books, if the situation continues to become much more centralized in Amazon and on online retailers, if great independent bookstores like the Strand cease to exist because of in part technological advances, but other things as well, predatory practices, we're going to lose the mechanism by which young writers are discovered. It just simply isn't going to exist anymore. And that's why some writers, and I, for instance, and Ann Patchett, who owns an independent bookstore in Nashville, and Scott Turow, Stephen King, and Dennis Lehane, and a few other writers have begun to stand up and say, look, never mind us, you know what? All the writers that I just mentioned, we all do just fine with the Amazon model. You know, because we are already household names, or we're certain, if not household names, we're certainly recognizable names. And what people are asking us online, and when we make statements about our love of independent bookstores and also our reservations about online bookselling, they're asking, why in the world are we biting the hand that feeds us? What in the world are you thinking? Amazon in particular, but also, you know, iTunes ebooks and Google Books. And, I mean, they all sell our work. Why are we so antagonistic towards them? And it's simply because that, well, we had an Amazon experience today with this book. This is a small press book that we made, and Kate's going to talk about why we made it the way we did. This is a small press book. We never expected it to have huge sales. But suddenly, last night, Kate noticed that our Amazon ranking went from something like number 20,000 to 1,200 and something. We figured, oh, that's just got to be a glitch. There's something that doesn't. We're gonna find out in the morning. We'll wake up. It's going to be back to the 20,000 that we thought it would. But it turns out what happened was that one of their algorithms, they wouldn't have done this as a favor to Richard Russo. I know that. But one of their algorithms apparently kicked in, and they sent out an electronic email to everybody who'd ever bought a Richard Russo novel on Amazon, offering 36% off the price tag of interventions, and we suddenly we now have a front list book on our hands, and everybody's saying, well, what the hell's so wrong with that, you know? But the only, and God knows we're not complaining. We didn't write a letter to Amazon and say stop doing this. But what worries those of us who are worried is that when you come into a great independent bookstore and you browse, you're much more likely to discover something you didn't know you wanted. And what you didn't know you wanted is probably by somebody you didn't know existed. And that person is probably younger. That's why you don't know who it is. And so, as a result of that, when you go into a great independent bookstore, nobody benefits from that more than Richard Russo in 1986 and someone like Lauren Groff in 2012. And so that's kind of why we're doing what we're doing, and it provides a kind of background to why excuse me, at the Russo dinner table for the last several years, we have been talking about what we love about books, what we love about books, these solid, concrete objects, and how we could marry, in a way that was just kind of second nature in the 19th century, the world of words with the world of images. And I have talked far too long. I'm going to turn this over to Kate to describe a little bit what we were thinking about both the writing of this book, but more importantly, the artwork that is so central to this book, and the design of the book. And we're going to get Tom to come in and join us here and talk a little bit about the design as well. So, Kate.
Well, I think after all that, I'm kind of coming from this really from a slightly different angle in terms of the way we started, which is in 2005 I started my MFA, moved to London to do that, and that's really when all this stuff was starting. You know, we were talking about ebooks then. They were sort of a bit of a myth at that point, I think, or certainly not everybody had a Kindle in their bag at that point. And the other industries were changing too. I was living in London, and Tom was doing a lot of photography at the time on his MFA, and there was three photography, this place called Metro, and you could get your photos developed there 24/7. And by the time we graduated, there was one Metro, and you could get your photos developed there 9 to 5, Monday to Friday. And that was what we started to see happening, was that all these sort of traditional outlets that we were learning in art school, because that's really where it came down to, is that we're still learning all the traditional methods, even though everyone's telling us that doesn't matter anymore, that those are going away. So we were really thinking at that time, what is it that we want to do? And people were starting to break up and say, okay, well, some people wanted to move faster, some people wanted to move with technology as fast as it was going, and then some of us wanted to go the other way, some of us wanted to slow down. And I was definitely more in camp slow down. So that's what we started with. When we started talking about this book, we would come home, I would come home, and we would have these conversations. And Tom actually was taking a bookbinding course at the time. So it was really the forefront of our mind. He was actually binding these books and coming to my dad and saying, isn't this great? Look at this paper, look at the way I'm binding, look at how I've bound this, I've sewn this one, I've glued this one, I've folded this one, I've done this, that, and the other thing. And I think that's really where we started in terms of, okay, well, what would we make? And so the three of us kind of sort of started talking about what our element of it would be. And Tom really piped in sort of, you know, a little bit further into the process and said, "Oh, that's great. You want to do a book. You want to have these paintings. So what is it going to look like?" And that was Tom's role. So I'll hand the mic to him in a second. He can talk about that a little bit more. But in terms of the paintings, what we really wanted, I'm not an illustrator by any stretch of the imagination. I'm trained as a fine art painter, and I don't think narratively at all. So that was the challenge for this: is to how do I how do I change the narrative language into a visual language, which is really what I was after. And that involved me really reading these stories and then taking a moment from these stories that I think really encapsulates the whole story, really slow it down. And that's what these paintings, I'm hoping, are going to do, which is that they encapsulate the whole story in one still, silent moment. And that usually has to do with the main character's obsession. You're going to find when you read these that these are all fairly obsessive people. And I'm trying to hone in on that fairly dark thought that they have and paint it in this moment. And so that's where we started. We started with a story called Horseman, and I read that and honed in on this wonderful moment where the main character, she's a professor, and she's being haunted by this poem, Robert Louis Stevenson poem from Child's Garden Verses, and she's running through the woods and she's got this real paranoia about this poem that I'm going to let my dad sing for you because I can't sing it.
Actually, I used to sing this to Kate and her sister Emily when they were children. I was trying to terrify them. It never quite worked. But it's a wonderful. If you get this song in your head, you can understand why it would be difficult to get rid of, because it has this strong iambic beat. You can kind of imagine this middle-aged woman who didn't hear it as a child, but she's heard it now, and when she runs in through the dark woods, she's oh yes, and this is the larger version of the. It's a poem called Windy Nights, and it's very iambic, and you can almost hear the footfalls as you go. It goes, whenever the moon and the stars are set, whenever the wind is high, all night long in the dark and wet, a man goes riding by. Late at night when the fires are out, why does he gallop and gallop about?
What? So it's something I was familiar with when I was a kid, and then, but the interesting thing about the character is that she comes to this much later in life, and that's why it haunts her. She can't get it out of her head, and you'll understand when you read the story why she can't get it out of her head. But she has this really dark thought where she's running through the woods, just getting some exercise, and feels as though she's running to the beat of this poem, and envisions herself running, and she kind of becomes the horseman. And the woods turns into, in her mind, turns into a cemetery. And for me, that was a kind of a, gosh, this is really that she's contemplating her own mortality because of this poem that I remember, gosh, from when I was a kid. And so I really thought about just how ludicrous that was and just how obsessive it was for her. But we all have these moments. We all have these things that we obsess about, that we make dark, that other people don't find dark. And so that's what I honed in on in this one and in all the stories. So these paintings are really meant to be those dark moments. And the covers are really just sort of more kind of abstract plays. I'm generally speaking, I'm an abstract artist, so these were kind of abstract plays on the sort of obsessive element that you'll see in the paintings in the actual stories. And once we got to that point, and we decided, I think with Horseman and High and Dry and Horse Child, we knew that those were going to be in there. And then when we started talking about these obsessive elements, that's when Interventions got written, sort of with that in mind. I think he's probably going to write it anyway, but it sort of made sense to write it now for this book at that point, which is another character who finds that his life has to be, he has to intervene in someone's life and someone else has to intervene in his. And so that's why it's called Interventions ultimately, is that all these characters' obsessions ultimately result in somebody needing to intervene in their lives in some way. And so I think at that point we'll kind of hand it over into the design, because the design is kind of, for us, was sort of a real intervention measure as well. And we really wanted to make the most tactile thing that we could, and with that in mind, I'm going to hand it over to Tom to talk about that a little bit.
Hello. I'd just like to start off by saying that I'm not a book guy. First of all, the idea of designing a book was an incredible opportunity for me. I don't come from a book background. Trained as a sculptor initially. and art history, first of all. And I read, I love reading, but I'm a very slow reader. I'm dyslexic. It takes me quite a long time to actually get through a book. But with that in mind, I've always been fascinated by the book as an object. I was looking at there's a J.K. Rowling book in the cabinet over there of Beedle the Bard, and it's a huge object, huge magical kind of looking object, and that must weigh a ton. And I love that. I love the kind of magic that these objects possess, but the content that these objects possess has always ever so slightly eluded me, because it takes me a while to get through them. So, how does a dyslexic design a book? Well, it's actually quite an opportunity. So when we were having these conversations, and we were talking about these 4 stories and these illustrations and these covers, my first frame of reference really was the idea of collections and of collecting CDs, CD packaging and designing and how I would collect things together. And I like the idea of taking what was initially a big collection of stories and breaking it down into kind of bite-sized parts so that you can enjoy each object in its own right. But then with the paintings, each small book has a print of a painting in it. It was then broken down further. So really what you end up with is a 9-piece collection that's kind of bound together in this slipcase. Almost like a kind of bookshelf portfolio of objects and of short stories and books. And I've recently been rereading the collection, and I love it. I really like it. It feels good. It feels nice in the hand. We laboured over the texture of the covers, the quality of the paper, the weight that the prints are on, the feel of the slipcase. So it makes a nice sound. It kind of smells good. It has a good feel to it. And so really, as an artist, from a sculptural perspective, it's like a real opportunity to investigate textures and feelings and all that kind of stuff. Like I say, I'm fascinated by books, but with the ebook, and I don't have a problem with ebooks, it's pure content. You download something onto your Kindle and you have something which is pure content, and that's fine. But for people that devour books in that way, that's absolutely fine. But personally speaking, I've always, by the time I'm finished with the book, it's like I've chewed it, and it has that kind of dogged nature to it. And I wanted to be able to choose in that kind of way. And I don't really feel that you can do that with an ebook. That's okay. So having the opportunity to work on this project with Rick and Kate was just absolutely incredibly exciting. Godsend, really. Yeah, that's all really I have to say.
With that in mind, that was one of the things that, with ebooks, and one of the things that I like about ebooks is that I think that it actually has, for those of us who prefer a more tactile book, it's allowing, I think, for the book industry just to become that much more creative in terms of the way we design things. This book wouldn't have been possible if it weren't for ebooks, because nobody would have wanted to know why we wanted to do something so special. They see us as reacting against something, which I suppose we are. But with that in mind, we, Down East, really wanted to do it with us as well, because they really saw that that this was a discussion. This was that otherwise wouldn't have happened if it weren't for ebooks. And with that in mind as well, there's lots of really wonderful things about ebooks. In terms of their environmental impact and sort of making reading just generally, I think, a more democratic process. So we did naturally get a little bit of a conscience when we were making this, and I spoke to Down East and said, okay, I still want to do no ebook on this, I still want to make a book, but can we make it with sustainable materials, and can we have it printed in the United States? Let's try to keep this as at home and as ethical as possible, which they did. They swallowed hard, but they did it. And you have to ask, and these things are possible. To be, it is possible to publish a book in the United States and have it made in the United States and on sustainable materials, but we learned you do have to ask. They wouldn't have done it that way if we hadn't asked them to do it that way. So for that reason, we're just that much more proud of it. It does drive up the price a little bit, and sorry about that, but it is, it's a good, solid, American-made object at the end of the day. I don't know if you have anything else you want to add to that, Dad?
No, I don't think so. I think, is my mic on at all? Yeah. Okay. I think we should just let our voices fall here and ask. We've covered a lot of territory here, maybe you have some questions either about the book or the process of collaboration between the three of us. Or the state of publishing, anything you'd like to talk about or any questions you have. We have a bit of time here, so we can answer some questions, and then of course we'll sign the books. Any questions? First one's always the tough one. Then everybody has their hand.
I'll ask, since
Okay.
what was it like collaborating? I mean, how did the process work? I mean, you had written this material, and then you talked about, I mean, how then did you process it visually? Were you showing the work? I mean, because it seems to be a three-tier process: the work, the written word, and then the visual sort of interpretation, and then the design of the book itself, which is sculptural.
Mm-hmm.
So, how did that work?
The day-to-day handoff of responsibilities.
And what was that interaction like within a kind of family process?
Yeah, okay. You want to start off with
Yeah, I think actually there was really, in a lot of ways, very little interaction in the sense that 3 of the pieces had already been written. He knew roughly what he was going to write for interventions, and so I took the 3 pieces, High and Dry, and Horse Child, and Horseman, away with me to the studio, read those, and really just started for a long time just kind of thinking about what it is I wanted to do, did some sketches, didn't like them, did some more, the normal process, but the actual sense of collaboration doesn't, I don't even know if the word fits, because we weren't working together, we weren't working side by side in any way. He wasn't allowed to tell me what he thought I should paint, certainly. So it was really just a process of me, a process really that kind of came down to trust for all 3 of us at the end of the day, which was that we all just had to trust that the other person knew what they were doing for their part. And nobody really challenged anybody in terms of what it was that we were doing. So when I would finish a painting, I would show it to him, and thankfully he always liked it. So, or at least he said he did. And then when it came down to the design, I think that was maybe more where the collaboration came in, because Tom actually made several designs, and then we all kind of came together on this one at the end of the day. So that was where most of the discussion took place. And then when Tom said, you know what, I think I want to have all of these individually bound, then I knew that I had to go back in the studio and paint covers for each one of the editions. So it was actually more the 2 of us that had to kind of bat back and forth. And then I suppose with interventions, we were talking about what we wanted the thread to be. We wanted there to be something in all 4 stories that was similar, the similar theme. So we did talk about that. We did talk about obsession. We did talk about wanting that to be in the idea of having an intervention to be that sense, that thread. And I say intervention loosely, by the way. Not all these characters are going to be sat around in a circle having an intervention. And so then that's when you went away to write that, really as we were sort of doing the design and doing these covers and doing these paintings. So we weren't in each other's hair too much, and I think that's the key to collaboration, certainly for us anyway.
Yeah, at least in this project, as some of you may know, I do some film work, which is hugely collaborative, and I've worked with enough writers and other writer directors like Robert Benton and and producers and actors. And my sense is that in collaboration, when things go wrong and people start talking about artistic differences and backing out of films, etc., it's because, at least in making films, there are areas of overlap. When I'm writing a screenplay, I'm in charge of the dialogue. It's my words that are going onto the page. And if they stayed on the page, it would always be just me. But of course, somebody's going to have to speak them. And a director is going to come along too and decide how they're going to be spoken. And so the words, the responsibility for the words and getting the words right may start out as the writers. But even the producers like to get their hand in. They like to put their stamp on a movie. And once a director comes on board, it really becomes his project, and yet ultimately how the words are spoken is going to depend on who you cast and whether that person hears what the director is hearing and what the writer is hearing. And when you're all on the same page, boy, it's wonderful. But in fact, as you can imagine, when there are overlapping responsibilities, you're not always going to be on the same page. And so that kind of collaboration is probably going to be very different from what we did. And you can also imagine the kind of collaboration that comes from, say, songwriters, one of whom is the lyricist and one of whom writes the melodies. They have different responsibilities, but there's a very good chance that they're going to be in the same room as they're working. Whoever's writing the melody is going to come up with something and then give it to the person writing the lyrics, and they're going to be right there, in the same room, day after day after day, probably two pianos facing each other, and so physical proximity of the two artists involved will often have an awful lot to do with the project, because in addition to everything else, these two people are in the same room together, and they may know each other pretty well. And what's going wrong on any given day may have nothing to do with the music. It may have something to do with the proximity and the nature of their friendship, and who said something on Monday that's still pissing somebody else off on Tuesday. And the nature of our
we do that, but not in the sense of this collaboration.
No. Yeah, Kate's been joking on the road that the collaboration has been no problem at all. It may be the book tour that kills us. So it was a genuine collaboration in the sense that it was a genuine conversation that had been going on for years. But we didn't have the problem of proximity, being in the same room. I'm not over there in her studio looking at what Kate's doing. And Tom was showing me the design only when it seemed like a good idea. And I certainly wasn't, in writing interventions, wasn't asking what Kate was doing because to make sure that it was going to be fitting in with the story that I was writing. We were working on separate moons, and then we'd come down to the other planet at some point to check in on each other. Yes.
You mentioned how the publisher was accommodating to not only the form but various other issues. Can you tell us more about that publisher and what was their stake in this? Did they do other books like this? Had you thought about working with other publishers? How did you manage that?
Well, one of the things that we knew about this was that because it was going to be a relatively small book, not small price, but a small book, was that to do it the way we wanted to do it, it just seemed to us that Knopf, the publisher of my novels, it just didn't seem like something that they would probably be interested in. So the first thing I did was describe to my editor what I was thinking about doing, telling him that I didn't think that Knopf would probably be interested in an art book. Essentially, it's fiction, but it's an art book. And Gary concurred right away that our sense of what this book would be was probably fit in with his sense of what it. And so he just gave us his blessing and said, go do this the way you want with another publisher. I think we went to Down East because I had done another book with them early on. I had done a book about hospice that went to benefit Maine hospices. And Down East Books, which is, as you might imagine, is centered in coastal Maine. They had done that book. All the money that we generated from that book went to charity. It had been a lovely experience that we had working with them. It was just a natural to go to them first because this book is a kind of locally grown thing. It kind of fits, kind of is in that suite that we feel now. At least some people feel that it's best to buy local and do things locally. And so this was in that kind of in that spirit of the book. But that said, we took Down East. They do beautiful books, but they tend to be books on gardening and sailing and things that you would expect a coastal Maine book publisher to do. And we took them out of their comfort zone. I think it's fair to say, almost immediately. And as Kate said, every time we said no, we want it to be this way, and they would say, well, we could do it cheaper. And I said, yeah, we'd say no. And they would swallow hard and say, okay. I don't think they knew if we knew what we were doing or not, but those were the things that we were interested in, and they did. I mean, right down the line. And these guys could talk more about that because they were the ones. Once I had written the words, my job was done. But the negotiations of how this book was going to come out, what it was going to look like and feel like, and how the various people at Down East Books managed at the end to say, all right, we still want to do this. Is there anything?
Yeah, well, I mean, we were really lucky in the sense that, as artists, we care about things that other people maybe necessarily don't care about. So we would wanna have coffee and talk about paperweights and textures and we really did. We labored over just about everything, including all the textures, all the weights, all the coloring, bless them, they came out with the designer there came out with the what's on the slipcase that for square design, and I said, oh, guys, I think those squares, I think they're a little bit bright. They don't match the colors of the paintings or the books. And they went back and they toned down the colors, and that's really what we needed, was somebody who was going to let us nickel a bit, because we knew we were going to do that, and it was a great collaboration with them in that sense, because they really did, and they said, oh, we think we should have text on the back, and we said, oh, no, we don't think we need text on the back, and thank God that they knew that we did need text on the back, that getting the quotes and actually having them write that paragraph about what the book is. Was their expertise. They knew that needed to be there, and we didn't. So that was, that was. But that's what we wanted ultimately, was a discussion. That's what we'd been doing for years, is having this discussion. And now when we moved into publisher, we didn't want them to say yes, whatever you want, or no, we're going to do it our way. We really did. We wanted to sit down and have a discussion, and Down East was really happy to do that. And they're part of a great sort of Maine tradition in terms of publishing books with really great imagery. So we knew that we wanted somebody who was interested in the images and not just the text.
Yes.
It seems to me like the flip side of what you were initially talking about, the large investment that publishers make in their authors, is probably a reduced barrier to entry. And I was going to see what your opinion was of how that's changing the books or the authors that become publicized.
Well, it's much harder now. It's much harder for young writers. So many of the things that, if you know Richard Russo's name, it's really because of so many of those things that are now gone, as I started out saying. But it also has something to do with the zeitgeist. I mean, you hear you hear people saying all the time that books should be cheap. And I understand at least a little about what they're talking about when they say that books should be cheaper. And I understand that the $40 on this book is going to seem expensive to a lot of people. A lot of people are just not going to be able to buy it because of its price. But the general notion that books should be cheaper, I disagree with for a lot of reasons. I think it's driven by the fact that a lot of people think that books should be cheaper because the price of producing at least the electronic version of these books has gone down so much, right? They understand that to make the print book, a novel like My Bridge of Sighs, which is the biggest and the most expensive to produce, was the most expensive because it was the biggest. There were more words, more pages, more everything, and so that book was priced the way it was. But the electronic version doesn't matter at all. How many pages are in the book? They don't have to make the book, and so a lot of people think that because, especially because the electronic version of the book costs so little to make, that the price of books should come down. And Amazon, of course, has played right into that. And for years, they sold certain books, electronic books, at a $2 loss. They were selling books that cost them $11.99. They were selling those books for $9.99, with the idea, not that they were philosophical. They did want to drive down the price of books, but the reason they wanted to drive down the price of books was that they wanted a monopoly. They wanted a monopoly for their Kindle. Amazon controls, what Amazon controls really is the backlist. the front list, which is the most popular books that are in physical bookstores right now, which is really only 1% to 2% of the books. Those are the books that Amazon always targeted for the lowest prices that they could, because they don't want you to go into the physical bookstore, right? They're not going to backlist Richard Russo novels or backlist anybody's novels. They're not going to sell those to you cheaply because they'd just be reducing their own profits. What they're after is that 1% of the books that are selling the most right now. Right? That's what they're after. And so they want to drive down the price of those books, and especially the electronic version of those books. And they're talking about it in terms of making these books more cheaper and making reading more democratic. That's the communique that they're putting out. In fact, I think that's a smokescreen. I think this is all about monopoly, and they're trying to the 75% share. They'd like to have more. You know, everybody wants more of everything. But the other real issue is that when people say that books should be cheaper, very often it's because they're thinking of books as a commodity. And when you buy something from an electronic bookseller, whether it's, we're not just talking about Amazon, we're talking about books that you can buy from Google or books that you can buy through your iTunes. You're thinking about them. You're thinking about them as a commodity, and of course, these huge electronic retailers encourage that because so many of the other things, bookselling is just, I'm sure you've noticed, is a tiny part of what Amazon sells. And a lot of what Amazon sells, most of what Amazon sells are in fact commodities. My wife and I just got back from Spain. We've been there for a few days, and we love these little padron peppers, and we have them with almost every meal on our tapas menu. It's the one thing that we always got, every meal, every day. We got these padron peppers, and they're just so delicious. But when we get home, it's got to be someplace in America where you can buy padron peppers. We're a big country. And so, as soon as we got back, we Googled padron peppers. We figured Whole Foods or somebody's got to have padron peppers. Guess what pops up for padron peppers? Amazon is the first thing you find. So, but padron peppers are, in fact, a commodity. And it's fair to ask, what is the fair price for a pound? What should padron peppers sell for? Because it's a commodity. Copper is a commodity. Cotton is a commodity. Wheat is a commodity. Pork bellies are a commodity. But you get into trouble when you start talking about things that are not really commodities. How much should tickets cost to a Yankee game? That's like saying, how much does the chair cost? Right? Because tickets to a Yankees game that's not a commodity. It's something else. Kate's paintings. What should Kate's paintings cost? Well, if you look at them as a commodity, they should cost 10% above the price of the paint and the brushes and the canvas. So as soon as you start looking at art or entertainment or any of these things, as long as you think of them as commodities because you buy them the way you buy other commodities, you're always going to be pissed off. You're going to spend the rest of your life pissed off at how much they cost, because you're always going to be thinking of them in terms of what should a pound of this cost. And with books, it's just not that way. And so it's a very long answer to your very simple question, but I think that's what's driving it. I think that's what's driving it a lot, is that the people who sell us things, increasingly online things, most of those things are being sold as commodities. And things like, and places like Amazon and eBay, and it's not just Amazon. I'm always pounding on Amazon, I know. But it's really electronic sales. They're constantly pounding the prices of things down. And I think it will work for some things. It will work for a pound of copper or something like that, or padron peppers, but it just doesn't work when it comes to anything where art or entertainment or anything that's inventive, anything that involves creativity. You just can't factor that in. Would you like to get some books signed?
Also, Kate's prints from the book are on sale as well.
Yes, Kate's the larger print size of these books. They will be signed.
They are signed, yeah.
But they are also numbered, and I think there are going to be 50 of each of these. So it's a very small print run. We won't be running any more.
And
so
they're extraordinarily.
have a look. Have a look.